So thank you. So the first thing I'd like to do is to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Great Barrier Reef region and their elders past, present and emerging. And it was actually a great thing that we switched talks from my perspective, Dwayne, because actually the other thing I wanted to draw to your attention was actually the connection of the Cape Melville and Flinders Island people, and actually their enduring connection with sea country, which actually has great relevance to what we were talking about earlier in terms of crown-of-thorns starfish. So I was lucky enough to visit this area, actually as a result of a survey a few years ago, and in the Stanley Island group, there's actually a particular place which some people may have visited. I don't think many people actually have, and I encourage you to do so if you can, and actually display some of the living memories of traditional owners, that group of traditional owners. And amongst the amazing rock art that's actually there, I draw your attention to a particular thing, which actually is paintings of crown-of-thorns starfish. Not one, but many. This happens to be in that dispersal region in Princess Charlotte Bay that actually Dave was talking about earlier on. So clearly, they're there for a reason. It's because traditional owners have been very aware of these particular animals. I can certainly imagine why. You don't want to step on one, etc. But actually, there's lots of knowledge out there about this particular species and how it interplays with the Great Barrier Reef, and it's within the sort of living culture of traditional owners. It's clearly a crown-of-thorns starfish. So the aspect of what I'm already going to talk about is actually how the sort of synoptic 30,000 feet, 50-year view of crown-of-thorns starfish management and how it fits into management as a whole. And really, I'd like to think of crown-of-thorns starfish a bit like chainsaws. Maybe they're brain saws. You know, they've got the little autonomous. I know it's a nerve ganglion, it's not a brain, but they're autonomous in their way of going around, ploughing out major areas of habitat. Coral is like trees in rainforests. It's habitat, and habitat equals biodiversity. So the whole point that we're actually, why we're taking these actions is because of protecting biodiversity. And that sits in the context of many other impacts, and cumulative impacts is what it's all about, really. We've heard some of that earlier on this morning, but the concurrent coral bleaching events, major cyclones, crown-of-thorns starfish outbreak, etc., and things like coral disease are all putting downward pressure upon that habitat. That's well recognised in the Outlook report. Clearly, climate change is the greatest threat to the reef, but other things are also major threats, including water quality, as we know, and crown-of-thorns starfish. We know what the status overall is, but the critical thing is that at the moment, the reef retains the ability to recover, provided disturbance-free periods are long enough. And of course, when you then look at the data that's available to us from the AIMS long-term monitoring program, we know what the major sources of immediate coral mortality are: cyclones, coral bleaching, and crown-of-thorns starfish. Only one of those is actually amenable to some kind of immediate management action. And alongside that, of course, we've got major investments in research in water quality, but also actions, and improving water quality is also seen as being a way of reducing the risk of COTS outbreaks. So, like Dave Westcott, I would argue that controlling COTS is an effort to protect the reef resilience overall. And really that's what's enshrined in the current Reef 2050 plan and the objective, which is actually about protecting coral habitat through the program that we've got today. And that's there's been an increasing emphasis upon COTS control in the Reef 2050 plan since its inception in 2015. I just wanted to draw your attention to, apart from the fact I like the term brain saw, because I'm a dad and like dad jokes. But aside from that, I think that the time frame over which management has been occurring, there's actually been efforts to control crown-of-thorns starfish for long periods of time. And I draw your attention to a couple of things that are really quite pivotal. One of them is actually, we know we had a pretty good idea that the outbreak was kicking off around about 2010. The program at its inception, sort of the 2013 to 15 period, was really focused upon tourism sites. And actually the funds were directed to tourism sites, and that's because there was a lot of scepticism about whether or not you could control starfish. So there was no actual ability to manage at a regional scale, really, because that's where the game was at that point in time. And there were successes then. Arlington Reef is actually arguably a success story. The other thing that occurred during that period of time was the advent of the one-shot technique. That actually revolutionised control in terms of feasibility. Without it, we wouldn't have been able to do the control program that we have today. Then other things, other players coming into the mix, more investment, etc. And absolutely the IPM in terms of having a strategic way of managing COTS. All of this has been happening alongside other major impact events, and so the need for this management intervention is actually getting stronger all the time. And that's been reflected in the outlet reports, in the Reef 2050 plan, and also in the blueprint for reef resilience that was published after the back-to-back 16-17 bleaching events by the authority and partners. So really, all of this story leads up to, if we want to actually achieve the aims of the Reef 2050 plan, which will soon be revised, then we need a concerted effort looking at how we can evolve our management hand in glove with the research that comes our way. So really, to that end, we've been actually looking at building a strategic management framework, looking at that sort of whole of reef scale, thinking about it from a cumulative impact perspective, and building in the research along the way. We have a Crown-of-thorns starfish strategic management framework document that sort of maps out how the control objectives at a whole of reef scale play out through time, through the waves of outbreaks, whether there actually are waves of outbreaks, whether there are periods that actually where we have no outbreak, or whether it's actually the fact that there are COTS somewhere all of the time. And overall, that's really been informed by the series of research endeavours that you've heard about this morning. And of note, I particularly like to identify things like the Integrated Pest Management Operations Manual and how that's enabled us to focus effort on high-value priority reefs. I'll make some comments about what we mean by that shortly. Controlling high-value reefs as a whole, using systemic surveillance to inform where colour effort should be invested, and then also looking at using ecological thresholds as a measure of effect, and actually making sure we have intensive repeat visitation at high-value reefs to get to those thresholds. So these things have incrementally improved the program, but they've also allowed us to understand the actual effect of what's happening. So to the effect of what's happening, the so what argument, and you've seen some of this from Dave, but I'm going to give it to you from the point of view of the actual on-water operations. At the moment, there are 5 vessels actually operating in the marine park. The reefs that have action going on them at the moment, many of those are actually, the thresholds have been achieved. Some of them have just proactive monitoring. That's the thresholds have been achieved and we want to go back. Some of those are the ones that Dave talked about as not actually requiring culling, but you need to know that they still don't require culling, that's important. And we've got a series of reefs where culling is underway. So there's about 222 reefs in total that have been actioned for COTS management, and it's about 100 a year, as Dave said. And you get the sort of the cull numbers as I can't remember the term that Dave used, but the sort of how do you get your maximum catch has been one of the ways in which we've understood the program to date. It's still relevant, but it isn't the only game. So really we're looking more about how things are going in terms of the ecological thresholds and whether they're being achieved. And overall at the moment, we've got thresholds achieved at 55 of those reefs, 52 reefs that actually have proactive monitoring going on, and culling still underway at 40 reefs. I'd just like to acknowledge that it's a joint effort. We draw on information not just from the culling teams, but also from the tourism industry through the Eye on the Reef program, from the AIMS long-term monitoring program, and the Reef Joint Field Management program to get a synoptic view of what's happening on the reef. To dive down to a sort of individual reef levels, and I'm just going to pick 3 reefs quickly to give you a sense of how the 3 operators and it's playing out across the different operations. So a reef like Bramble Reef, I flew over Bramble yesterday. It makes you realise how long you've been working in coral reef stuff when you can recognise a reef from its outline when you look at it from a plane, but which is actually a lovely thing to be able to do. But Bramble, when it was first surveyed back in February 2019, we had significant numbers of COTS. It was an established outbreak. Well, now, as of August last year, it was at no outbreak status. Similar story at the southern end of the reef, which is Lady Musgrave, obviously crucially important for tourism. Again, when the surveillance was first done there was an established outbreak, and actually by midway through last year, it would culled down to no outbreak status. I'm going to talk a little bit about John Brewer Reef, which is offshore from Townsville, because we've sort of coining this term recalcitrant reef. It's actually the reef that's had the 55 visits that Dave talked about. And interestingly, I think that what we've learned along the way from John Brewer has almost been invaluable. This is a really important reef from a tourism perspective in the Townsville region, but for some reason it operates in perhaps a slightly different way from some of the other reefs. There seems to be a reservoir of COTS in the lagoon. Once we've started opening up cull sites in the lagoon, we're actually seeing a move towards sustainable thresholds. But perhaps the other thing to note is actually the downstream consequences. There's tantalising evidence from the AIMS LTMP team that we're actually seeing less COTS on the downstream reefs than happened in previous outbreaks. And that partially may be attributed to the efforts that have gone on this reef and others in that region. So sometimes the benefit might not be apparent, but it's actually the downstream benefit. So we have to adjust potentially the objectives that we're trying to achieve. At face value, you might say, is it worth 55 voyages? Well, one, it's useful because it helps us understand these types of reefs, but we also have to think about it in the context of the downstream consequences. COTS outbreak dynamics as a whole, between 2011 and 2018, those red dots give you a sense of where the outbreaks were most significant. That's as an aggregated picture. Obviously, COTS aren't everywhere all of the time. In 2018, concentrated in the southern, central and southern, the white little dots there are actually reefs which are actually below threshold as a result of control. By 2019, we had even more of those reefs under control and below threshold, and actually, as of this year, we have, that's really the operations in terms of outbreak dynamics from a mandatory threshold point of view really indicate that all of those reefs in the central section are at non-outbreak levels. It's important to note that even if they're at non-outbreak levels, that doesn't mean there aren't COTS there, and it doesn't mean that actually the IPM is finished on those reefs. So, the other important thing to note, of course, is there's been cumulative impacts across all of those areas during that period of time. The data on the left is just showing you that actually those red spikes there are actually across the whole of the park. That's coral bleaching. We've seen major mortality from other pressures, and that's why we have to think about COTS control in the context of cumulative impacts. So is it working? The picture on the left is a sort of a sad little picture, and that it actually shows that coral cover is actually pretty low across much of the park, and I would say that that's largely attributed to what's been happening in terms of other impacts beyond crown-of-thorns starfish. The data at the top right here actually shows that from both the RIS surveys, the Reef Health Impact Surveys, and the Mantato, coral cover is largely being preserved at the similar levels, whether between the initial and latest cull survey. So we're preserving coral cover. And actually in the bottom right, I'm not expecting you to see, it says 3 on here, not 2, that's actually a graphic that actually illustrates modelling that suggests that had we had no culling, then actually the projected losses, which is the yellow sort of line, means that we would have actually seen more losses on those reefs if culling hadn't been in place compared with what actually happened. It's a challenging space to actually measure the coral outcomes, but nevertheless, I think we're getting insights that it's actually really working. Last couple of slides. So where are we going to next? I think you've seen some of the stuff this morning. That little circle diagram is actually the summary from the Reef Summit and the blueprint for resilience that I mentioned before. And really it has sort of 5 main components: build a resilience network, enhance compliance with zoning, control crown-of-thorns starfish, protect key species, and facilitate restoration. My message to you is that these things need to work in concert. I think what you saw from Frederica gives a tantalising glimpse of where we go to next. And given that essentially we're playing an overarching, ongoing game of snakes and ladders, really, in terms of the marine park, and there's just more snakes on the board these days than there were in the past, it's critical that we work out how these tools fit together. There's a tantalising glimpse of coming now of what the zoning plan has already done in terms of prevention, already done as a prevention measure. The question is, how do we target other tools to best effect? And again, you'll hear some talks from Pete Mumby and others about some of the tools that are being developed, or you'll see some screenshots of them that actually help us to understand the cumulative impact dynamics on the reef and how they play out. Suffice to say at the moment that we continue to prioritise reefs on the basis of both their ecological importance and their economic value, and make decisions each year about which are the priorities based upon the outbreak dynamics. Ecological importance could be green zones within the park, but it may be many other factors in terms of outbreak dynamics. But also there's the critical things to consider, like the importance to tourism and their World Heritage value. And the targets that we select, there's 260 of those at the moment, are really based upon the best combination of those reefs to try and maximise the effectiveness of the program. Last slide. So in essence, really, if you take that sort of message really from the blueprint, which is how do we build upon these tools, we've already got major investment going on in each of these areas. And the answer is, well, you build more ladders and try and reduce the snakes. In the words of Rod Schneider from Jaws, perhaps we need a bigger boat. But overall, in reality, I think that was Dave's message as well. It's really about how we can enhance what we already know and then use all the tools at all of the scales in order to be able to get the best possible outcome for the reef. Thanks.